Hello, we are in 2 Samuel 21. I think we went on this a little bit. We ended with this, so I'll just quickly recap. A famine came over the land, and there was a famine for a couple of years, and David inquired of God why the famine was happening, and the Lord answered. It was because of the Gibeonites. And do you remember the Gibeonites? It goes all the way back to Joshua, when they tricked Joshua that they were not local, and that they had come a long way, to be with them and serve the Lord, and blah, blah, blah. And Joshua made a covenant with them because he forgot to, he didn't inquire of God. The Gibeonites became forced laborers, but they were not allowed to do anything with them. They were allowed to stay and be a part of Israel. All right? Well, Saul, it said in his zeal thought he was doing the right thing, but in his ignorance and didn't care about what God had commanded, started to kill the Gibeonites and attack them when he was king. And now the Lord is bringing a repercussion on Israel for his choices. Now what's interesting too is it didn't happen right away. A lot of times we think, the Lord will just act the next day when something happens. Well, this is years later. This is like 20 years, no, maybe even more, like 25 years later. All right? At least 20. And, this is now the Lord is bringing this about. We don't know if the Gibeonites cried out or if there was just the timing now for it. But either way, it was the Lord's timing, which is we don't always understand or get. That Saul had been killing and attacking the Gibeonites and not caring about the fact that Joshua, leader of Israel, before the Lord, made a covenant with the Gibeonites that Israel would not attack them, that they would be part of Israel. All right? And so David goes to the Gibeonites and says, what can we do to appease you from this wrong that has been done to you? And they said, give us 7 sons of Saul, and we can hang them on 7, gallows. And for all the people that he killed, I guess he killed a lot of Gibeonites. And David didn't know what to do, didn't want to do it, but he had no choice. He had to do it. All right, the Lord had brought this about punishment because of what Saul had done, and of course it also fulfills prophecy concerning Saul. All right, and Saul's house because of his rebellion. So they found 7 male descendants of Saul, handed them over, but he spared Mephibosheth, who was the son of Jonathan, who was the crippled son of Jonathan, who eats at his table and lives with him in Jerusalem. Right? Yeah. And when they did this, then it was appeased, and the Gibeonites moved on, and the famine was was over, and the normal cycle was restored. So it's an interesting story because, first of all, the Lord brought this about on Israel because they had broken a covenant that they made, and the Lord held them accountable to what they swore in His name, right? And they swore that they would not touch the Gibeonites in His name through Joshua, and it still stuck, period. The Lord doesn't, with time, His oaths that you don't go away. And also, it's interesting too that it took, a good bit of time before it brought it about. And I always thought that was interesting. But anyway, that was an important story. So let's move on to now 22. At the end of 21, it goes back to there was war again with the Philistines. Verse 18. Now it came about after that there was war again with the Philistines at Gob, and love this name here, Sibbecai, the Hushathite, struck down Saph, who was among the descendants of the giant, meaning they're still there. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the bloodline, there's, when that one of descendants gets that mixed bloodline, and then they pass it down, and it, continually passes down, that's why they had to be wiped out. You also notice that the Lord uses David to seemingly go after this and and wipe this out from the land of Israel. Okay. But you see that Goliath was not the only one among the Philistines. There was a whole family of them. Right. 21, and when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. And this was actually a brother of Goliath. Verse 22, these four were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Okay, so it was four of them who were descendants of of the giants in. We know Goliath, right? This is another one, and there was two more. Verse 22, and David spoke the words of this song to the Lord in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all of his enemies and from the hand of Saul. Now this is a psalm of David. Okay, it is also, a lot of it's in Psalm 18. But so let's move on because we don't have time to go through that, even though there's good stuff in there. And of course, David was a worshiper and a songwriter and a poet, right? So, and it commemorates what the Lord has done for him. Chapter 23. Now, these are the last words of David. This is a song, his last song that he wrote. Summing things up. Okay, it's really good. And of course, there is something important in here. Let's go to verse 5. 23 verse 5. Truly is not my house so with God, for he has made an everlasting covenant with me. How long is an everlasting covenant?
Everlasting.
Okay, just making sure you're paying attention. Ordered in all things and secured for all my salvation and all my desire. Will he not indeed make it grow? But the worthless, every one of them, will be thrust away like thorns, because they cannot be taken in hand. But the man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they will be completely burned with fire in their place. Poetic language to say, if the Lord is not for you, you're an enemy of God. Right? Anyway, verse 8. These are the names of the mighty men whom David had. Joshabasheth, that first one is a tough one. Joshabasheth. Just say it fast. The Kemanite, chief of the captains, he was called Adino the Eznite because of 800 slain by him at one time. In one battle, he killed 800 men by himself. 800 men. And after him was Eleazar the son of Dodo the Ahohite, one of the three mighty men with David when they defied the Philistines who were gathered there to battle, and the men of Israel had withdrawn. It's awesome. And he stood and fought when the army withdrew, and he stood by himself in the middle of the field and just pushed them back by himself with them all around. The men came back and fought again. Awesome. And then there was Shammah, the son of Agag the Hararite. And the Philistines were gathered in a troop where there was a plot of ground full of lentils, and the people fled from the Philistines. But he took his stand in the midst of the plot, defended it, and struck the Philistines, and the Lord brought about a great victory. See, the Lord gave them a supernatural. Remember what the Lord did with Samson?
Right.
Now, these men aren't like insanely strong, but the Lord has just given this. Remember, he was a promise to Joshua through Moses to the people that when they were faithful to him, that one of them would send 1,000 to flight, right? And when they broke his covenant, one man would send 1,000 of their men to flight. And that's why David, the Psalms of David always say the battle is the Lord's. Right?
Yes.
But the Lord has given them such a blessing that these soldiers do things that should not be done. Right? And that's the point. God's blessing in hand is with them. Okay. And what's interesting is that David they noticed when David was a young man, David was like this. And we also know that David isn't big. David isn't a big, huge, strong guy. He's a very average sized guy. But yet he was renowned for being a fierce warrior. So it wasn't about his size. Okay. 13. Then 3 of the 30 chief men went down and came to David at harvest time to the cave of Adullam, while the troop of the Philistines was camping in the valley of the Rephaim. That's where the valley of the giants. I love this. David was craving the water. I love this story. His men so, held him in honor. But even that, they're so crazy and full of faith and just nuts that David was mentioning how the best water was in this well in Bethlehem. But there was a Philistine garrison there in front of it. So 3 men broke through the army barracks, which would mean there would have been thousands of soldiers around. Broke through 3 of them together just to get to this well to bring water back to David. Okay? And of course then after they did this, David did something that was very illogical, because David is illogical. After they did this, he pours it out. And I remember when I first read that many, many years ago, like, what? Wouldn't they be insulted? They just risked their lives and everything just to get him water. And he pours it out. But the truth is, what he did was actually to honor them. Because David felt unworthy of this. And actually the word is a libation. It means a drink offering. And he did it with an offering, and he said, I am unworthy of this. And we offer it to the Lord as an incredible statement of his the favor that he had given these soldiers. David was so honored that he could not, remember, David has a heart to not rise himself above his men, right? According to Deuteronomy, I think it's 16 or 17. Right? So he felt so, if he drank this, he would be lording it over them. He couldn't possibly drink it. Only the Lord could receive this offering for what they did. So instead, the men were not insulted. Did this just die?
Yeah.
I guess he didn't change it last week.
No, he definitely did.
Wow, they shouldn't have died that quick. Maybe it was left on. Okay, well, there is some batteries here. Maybe some of them are good. Or they're all dead.
Yeah.
That's probably what it is.
They're like the dead ones from last week.
There's like 2 sets of batteries down there. Okay, well, you know what? I know it can still hear me on there. So Brandon, can you come here and help me? I'm going to keep going. Take these. Actually, I'll just do it really fast. Hang in there with us. There is batteries right here. Hopefully they're good. Nope. More dead batteries.
Those are dead. Okay, well.
You know what? I'm just going to talk loud because it can get me. It can get me just fine. Brandon, can you get me some more? I'll just keep going while we wait for those. Okay, so David pours it out, and he honored the Lord, and he really honored these men by doing it, showing that what they did was such a valiant thing that it brought honor to the Lord. So he wasn't insulting them; he was actually honoring the men. Okay. But to think of what they did was quite incredible. Now, it's amazing that this is in here, but this is in here to show you just that the favor of God with all of these men that met David in the cave, that he gave them this anointing for war. And guess how many wars they ever lost? Not a single one. They always won. It's a pretty good track record. All right? All right. Anyway, so moving on, but that was awesome. I always thought about what a good movie this would make. You know? Anyway, I got batteries. Hallelujah.
Got the other ones out.
Yeah, take those energizers there. That would be a smart move, but we don't always do smart moves. Ah ha ha! I am back. Okay. So moving on, that was, and of course there was 3, and then there was 3 that were absolutely renowned, and there was 30 who did incredible things. And notice in the 30 that Uriah the Hittite was one of them.
Yeah.
All right, and a Hittite is not an Israelite. He's not a descendant of Jacob, but remember that the Hittites were actually the people who had the original Jerusalem. But remember that the Lord always gave an opening to any Gentile who wanted to come and be circumcised and become part of the commonwealth of Israel and become one of them, right? Mm-hmm. Which we always forget that. But the Lord is the one who gave all people the opportunity to come and be a part of his people. And that was always in there. And it's an important lesson, especially as of course, the Lord sends the gospel to the Gentiles. It's an important lesson to remember that. Okay. So, moving on. 24, that brings us to a very important story, the census. All right, the census is... my nose is bleeding. I just saw blood on my... I rubbed my nose and I was like, there's blood. Okay, I guess okay. It was very dry before. Anyway, okay. There's this. Now, the census is an interesting story. There's a lot to this one. This one deserves a little explaining. Now, this is recorded, like most of David's life, this is recorded here, and it's also recorded in Chronicles. And we get, in this story particularly, we get a couple of interesting little details in Chronicles that we don't get here. Okay? I'm going to try to give the overview of the story. So David, things are going well, and he's fought, and this is a little bit later on in his kingship, you could say. And he is feeling, proud of what's happened. But something is very interesting about this story, and it's an important point to understand when you get to the part where David is saying, these are just sheep, why not me? It all comes down to right here. Just start in chapter 24, verse 1. Now the anger of the Lord burned against who?
Israel.
Not against David. It actually says the anger of the Lord burned against who? Israel, not David. And it incited David against them to say, go and number Israel and Judah. A very important lesson. Wait right here. Let's go over to 1 Chronicles 21. Now, remember that. Now, again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel and incited David against them. So the Lord incited David against them. Let's go to 1 Chronicles 21. So just a cool little lesson here. I went to 2 Chronicles. That's not going to help me. 1 Chronicles 21. Now look at this. So who did it say incited against them? The Lord incited David against the people. In Samuel, right? Look at this. Then Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. In Samuel, it says the Lord. In Chronicles, it says Satan.
Chronicles what was that?
1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. Which one is right? Do we have a major contradiction here? Well, if you remember the teaching of Job, there's no contradiction at all. Because both are correct. The Lord was upset with the people for their false gods and falling away. So he allowed the enemy to stir up David, because David is the king, to do something that was tempted him to do something bad, and he gave in. We don't exactly know how that worked out, but David obviously had a little bit of pride that the enemy was able to exploit, right? You have to give him a way in. He doesn't just have free reign, but the Lord allowed him, took the covering off of David because he was angry with the people. Why? Because David is the king. But isn't that interesting? It says the Lord, and then it says David. And remember when I explained that to you before, the lesson about the Lord allowing is so important. Who is in control? Is it the devil? God is in control. From their mindset, this is the reason why this both are right. Ezra, the priest, now after the exile, is chronicling, and he's writing the history, and he's using Samuel as one of his sources, right? But he knows that it says that, but he is now giving the other side of it. The devil. Now there's also people that say, I've heard people say, oh, well, Satan isn't in the Old Testament. He's only in the New Testament. Baloney. I don't know how people have the audacity to say that, but some people do. And, of course, Job.
Yeah.
He's a main character.
Yeah.
And here. And a couple other places. Now, he's not all over the place. Obviously, he was in the garden, but we know, Ezekiel 28, Isaiah 14, or is it Isaiah 28, Ezekiel 14. I think I had it right the first time. Anyway, so he's there, but he's not all over the place, but he is there. But this is in accordance with Job. Satan was used, but the Lord allowed Satan and gave Satan room to operate because the people were falling away. All right? So you guys get that because I've explained that to you now. But it is it sets theology, backs up the Hebrew theology, which is the Lord is in control. And the enemy is only allowed to operate in the sphere where the Lord allows him to. And he has given us a choice that we can open ourselves to the enemy through sin. Right? But the enemy does not have free reign over us, especially us as believers. When you're in his camp, you're in his camp. But David had the covering of God. Remember, the Lord took his hand off of Saul. What happened? Remember? Right? So the point is that the Lord allowed the enemy room here to use something. David obviously had a little bit of pride going. But the Lord did it. That's why both are right. The Lord did it because the Lord is ultimately in control, but yet the Lord allowed, used the enemy to do it. Right? Now, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. That is a very important theological lesson. Now, I've explained this to you before, but this is one of the important examples. If you didn't have that understanding and you just looked at both of these, you'd think this is a major contradiction, and how does this make any sense? Okay. Anyway. Let's go back. We are actually in chapter 24, 2 Samuel 24. So let's just go into the census. So the Lord allowed, stirred up David, and David obviously was just a little bit, he's a very humble man, but is starting, has had incredible success, and he's finally really doing well, and he, gets some room for a little arrogance. And of course the enemy uses that as his way, his open door. Which is this idea of, now why is this bad? The question I always get every year is, why is this such a big deal? You think that, we know Bathsheba was bad. And we see when David paid an incredible price. David would have rather have given his life than what he paid for. With his children and his family and all, right?
Yeah.
But this... seems like it's not that big a deal. But it is a big deal to God. And I'll explain it. David has this idea of, let's number the fighting men. Now, Joab, it's interesting that Joab and some of the other commanders didn't like it. And what did Joab say? Joab said, well, let the Lord multiply, the men, incredibly. I'm paraphrasing here, but we don't have to, why would we do that, But Joab was had the position that David always had, which is the battle is the Lord's. David has always won by trusting God, whether the Lord is going to give him the victory or not. Doesn't matter how many men, doesn't matter any of that. David fought and won every battle without using the number one weapon, which was a chariot. All right? So the point is that David has always relied on the favor of God and has never thought about how many men he has.
Right.
See, this is what Gentile kings do. Number their forces so they can say how many men we have to go against you, and right? But David has never thought that way before. That's why Joab says, oh, let the men be as the number of the seashore. It doesn't matter. Right? The battle is the Lord's. Well, that's what was wrong. David, from a lot of the other kings, this would have been no big deal compared to the things that they did. But for David to do this out of pride, the Lord was hurt by it, because David has never thought about whether, his military strength. He's only been concerned about whether God wanted them to fight or not. Right? So David, this is a statement of pride. Counting your men and being able to say how many incredible fighters you have is the pride of man. Right? And that is what's going on here. And I remember, many years ago being faced with that, and you have to look at, well, really, what is... Well, that's exactly what it is. Because then all of a sudden you see, now David was conscience-stricken. So David started to feel really bad about it, realizing Joab was right. Right? So he orders this census, and Joab and some of the commanders say, no, let's not do that. Okay, but yet he overruled them, and they went out, and they didn't even do it. And in Chronicles we get this little piece that they didn't even go all the way, that they didn't even finish, because it was distasteful to them to do this. All right? And they came back, and of course, before they even came back, David was conscience-stricken because he realized he did something wrong. He realized there was only an arrogant king would do this. Right? And then, of course, the prophet comes in and says to David, I believe it's Gad this time. There's two prophets that come to David through his kingship. There was Nathan, and there was Gad. Okay? Nathan's an easy name to remember, but Gad is a little tricky one. But so I haven't heard many children named Gad. I'm surprised.
Yeah.
Huh?
You had a lot of Nathans.
Yeah, there's a lot of Nathans. Well, anyway, so he comes in and says, and David already has known now that this was a very sinful thing that he did in the eyes of God, because the Lord has given him victory. Remember, they had 400 men who used to take on armies. Right? So he gives them. When David arose in the morning. This is verse 11. This is 24, verse 11. The word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, "Go and speak to David. Thus says the Lord says, I am offering you 3 things. Choose for yourself one of them, which I may do to you." So God came to David and told him and said to him, "Shall 7 years of famine come to you in your land, or will you flee for 3 months before your foes while they pursue you, or shall there be 3 days pestilence in your land? Now consider and see what answer I shall return to him who sent me." You're thinking about, why is David... Now, this is what David did this, and he's thinking all about himself. But the Lord had to give David the lesson. This was about the people, and he is the leader of the people. It wasn't specifically about David. The enemy used his pride for him to do something sinful and bring about this. But the people were already becoming more and more falling away from God.
Yeah.
Okay? And rebelling against him.
Yeah, the Lord was against Israel.
All right? So David goes over these three options. Now, David was the only king who ever got options. He actually got to choose which punishment Israel was going to receive. Okay? The Lord gave him, and of course, in David's answer is such an incredible statement again of who David is and how he knows the Lord, how he has a heart like God's. Famine, okay, all kinds of things can happen with famine because people get starving, they get desperate, they do crazy things, right? And so he didn't want famine, but he definitely didn't want the sword because famine has a lot to do with men. Sword is all about men. The Lord would use men to bring it about. So David takes the one option that is completely supernatural. He says, no, I would rather fall into the hands of the Lord because he is merciful. Don't let us fall into the hands of men. David has never run from his enemies. Once, ever. He has never had to retreat. They do not, they've never lost a battle. But I love his confidence in the mercy of God. We'd rather deal with the Lord directly because he's merciful. And it's just such a statement of David's heart towards the Lord, right? And the Lord is merciful because when the angel comes to Jerusalem, he stops him. 3 months of falling from their enemies would have killed a lot more men than was, even though there was 70,000. You have to consider you're dealing with around 4 million people. I mean, even that they just counted, 1,300,000 fighting men of their best fighters. So that would easily be a people of 4 million plus of the whole group, right? So although that seems like a large number in comparison to Israel's population, it's a very small number, right? Does everybody see that? And if they had lost a bunch of battles for 3 months, they'd have lost a lot more men than that.
How come those numbers, those tallies are a little different in Chronicles and 2 Samuel?
You mean as far as...
one says 800,000, one says 1.1 million?
Yes.
How come that's...
Some of it's arguments over ancient texts.
Yeah.
And things like that, where they're looking at different numbers, and some of it's the translators trying to get it right. And of course, some of the numbers and things when it comes to numbering the men, I don't exactly know. I've looked into it, there's not a lot of answers. Some of it has to do with, like I said, there was disagreements with some of the texts when it came to figures. So they went with the one that best suited it. But they weren't so concerned about it. Most of the numbers line up, but when it comes to the census, they're not exactly the same in the two accounts. Now, Ezra's using multiple sources in Chronicles.
Yeah.
Okay, Kings is just one of the sources. I mean, Samuel is just one of the sources he's using. Okay. But he also could have found, because he also says that they didn't go all the way. So it could be that was actually this many, but he only reported this many.
Right.
You get what I'm saying?
Because that number wasn't supposed to be...
Yep, and he doesn't count the Levites, which is a whole nother tribe that wasn't even counted in that. Mm-hmm. Right? So... anyway, so that's why, there was a little dispute over that, so. It doesn't really affect the story, but anyway. There is little things like that, numbers and dates and stuff, and numbers sometimes that don't always exactly line up. And a lot of that has to be with disputed texts and things like that. And different times where, a lot of professors can squabble over little things like that. You know what I'm saying?
Not a salvation issue.
Not a salvation issue, exactly. Anyway, I looked into that before and I didn't get any good answers, so I don't have a lot of good ones for you, to be honest with you. Anyway, okay, brain, come back to what I'm doing here. I'm severely jet lagged and out of my brain is still swirling around. So, but there's at least I would say it's closer to 5 million as a minimum guess of the overall population of Israel. All right? So it could be much higher than that. So when you look at that percentage, it was actually a very, very small percentage of people that were affected by this pestilence. So David does not want to deal with man, he wants to deal with the Lord directly, so the angel now comes. Now it doesn't mean, now what's interesting is, what is the angel doing? Bringing pestilence. Are they all seeing an angel? No, they're waking up with disease. Like this crazy pestilence has come over them. All right? So who brought disease on the people?
Lord.
But God can't give disease to anybody, can he?
Yes, he can.
Yes, he can. Did he just do it? Yes, he did. All right. So an angel is going through. Now David sees in the spirit, and I'm adding a couple of the details that are in Chronicles that add a little bit more to the story. There's a little bit more in the Chronicles account. And it says that David is looking at Jerusalem, and he's looking out, and he sees this huge angel. Because David sees in the spirit. David is a seer, remember. Right? And is standing between heaven and earth. That means pretty big. What do you think? Right? And then of course the Lord, the angel stretches his hand, is about to go to Jerusalem, and the Lord stops him. Says, no, don't do it. Relent. So the Lord is exactly as David said. Once the angel was about to strike Jerusalem, he just couldn't do it. He didn't want to do it. The Lord actually stopped it and said, no, enough. Why? Because the Lord is merciful. Just like David proclaimed, right? He fell into the hands of men, and they were going to just lose every battle they fought for a while, and David didn't trust what men would do. Right? But he declared the Lord is merciful. And then the Lord, of course, was going to go to Jerusalem. The angel was going to go to Jerusalem, and the Lord stopped him. I just always see that as such an awesome statement and proclamation of the Lord's heart. So Gad comes into David again while he's watching this. And the Lord cries out. David first cries out to the Lord, saying, Lord, why are you doing this to these people? It was me. I sinned. Deal with me and my family. Don't deal with all the people. They're just sheep. David felt very terrible that people were suffering for his choice. But see, he didn't completely get it. The Lord had to teach him a lesson here. Okay? The Lord was dealing with the people and showing that there was something, the Lord was allowing something to break out in them so they would turn back to him and repent and ask for forgiveness and healing. Okay? So, then Gad comes into David and says, the Lord told him to tell David to go up to Araunah the Jebusite's threshing floor. Now, the picture here is the city of David is down in the valley. This in the original. This wouldn't have all been here, obviously. It's down at the bottom of the hill. On top of the mountaintop, all right? Okay, this would have all been the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite up here. Okay, the city's down at the bottom, in the mountain. Okay, all right? So he goes up there, and he sees him. Of course, he comes to Araunah, and Araunah obviously is a wealthy landowner who's not an Israeli, because he's a Jebusite, right? And he sees King David come, and he goes out to him and says, and David says, the Lord has instructed me to build an altar here. And to him, and there's a little bit more detailed instructions that the Lord gave him. We get those detailed instructions in Chronicles. We don't necessarily get them here. Anyway, so then Araunah says to David, here, take it. And I have oxen, and I have wood. I have everything you need here. Take it. Araunah was just going to give it all away. And then, of course, David declares, I will not offer anything to the Lord that costs me nothing. Of course, in accordance with Torah, if David was doing an offering that was free, it wasn't an offering, right? So he gave him more than it was all worth. Okay, 40 shekels is a lot. 40 shekels of pure silver. Okay, I don't know how much that translated at the time, but that would be even a lot now. Anyway, so he just did that, and of course the lesson remains, don't give, our offerings need to cost something. If they don't cost, if you don't feel it, it's not an offering. Right? So, then they set up the altar, and now what we get in Chronicles is awesome. We don't get it here in Kings. I mean, in 2 Samuel, is that David prays now, and fire comes out from the Holy Spirit and lights up the wood. The Holy Spirit, like he did in the tabernacle and in the temple, actually consumes the wood, and the angel then goes up. And we get that picture in Chronicles. We just get a little more detail into the story, and I think it's a really cool detail. But anyway, from this point on, guess what this place becomes? The Lord sent him to this spot, and the Lord is the one that chose the spot. David did not choose the spot of the temple. The Lord did. The Lord did. The Lord sent him here, had him do this sacrifice for the people. Right? And the Lord would relent, and then from this point on, there was appointed this was going to be the spot of the temple. The place where Moses always said, multiple times, well always, but said 3 different times, the place where I choose to put my name forever. Because the ark has still been in a tent. None of it has ever been, the tabernacle has not been put into its final resting place. Right? Well, anyway, the Lord chooses the place for the temple. And of course, when this place, David bought it, right? And from now on, he starts thinking about the plans for the temple, and he thinks he wants to build it, but he can't. All right? So anyway, that ends 2 Samuel. Now, also the story picks right up into Kings because they were consecutive books, and they were written and they go right in. All right? And the seers who continued on, who were taught by Samuel, also wrote the book of Kings. And they kept the record. That's also why Kings so focuses on all the prophets. And we get to Elijah and Elisha. Okay? It focuses on the prophets because it was written by the prophets. All right? And anyway, so the Lord chose the place, which of course became the Temple Mount. So now we have an addition. It starts with Mount Moriah, all right? Then it became the next thing now. Then it became Aruna, the threshing floor, became the site of the Temple Mount, which becomes Mount Zion. All right? And we're going to keep building on it. So one thing we get from Chronicles that we do not get here. Now it goes right to where David is in old age at the end. In Chronicles, there's a lot filled in with the time that David does before. And then David's words to Solomon here, we only get like 2 sentences. In Chronicles, you get like a whole chapter on David's things that he said, all the things he said to Solomon. Okay? But we get a lot more detail there. But one thing that we do get, when you piece them together, is that, especially from Chronicles, is that from the point that David got this as the temple spot, he started preparing. He couldn't build it. But in Chronicles, when he's charging Solomon, he gives us this thing. The Lord gave him a complete download. The Lord gave David all the plans and all the dimensions. David says that in Chronicles. The Lord gave it all to him. David actually had all the dimensions of the temple, and he started preparing materials years in advance now. He's preparing materials. He's all his wealth as king for all this time and all the plunder. He gives most of it already in the treasury. Instead of passing it down, he gives most of it already to being part of the preparation for the temple. He starts prepping wood and plan and materials. And he says to Solomon, look at all this. I couldn't build it, but this is all ready to go. Solomon did not come up with the plans and all that. David did. He passed it and he charged Solomon to do it. All right? So that we get from Chronicles. David so wanted to, but the Lord would not let him. But he did everything else he possibly could, but just actually start to build it. So, anyway, chapter 1 of Book of Kings, like I already told you, continues on and very likely written by the seers who were taught to do that. All right? So, David is old. Now, this is at the end. Now, King David was old, advanced in age, and they covered him with clothes, but he could not keep warm. He's almost 80 years old. Okay, we know he passes away at 80, so he's very close to that at this point, and he just can't keep warm. Okay. So now a lot of us don't exactly get this part, but one thing you have to understand is he is the king, and also, actually the Ecclesiastes, the words of Solomon, I think it's Ecclesiastes. Two lie down together. No, that's actually Proverbs. Two lie down together, they'll keep warm. One by himself has no way to be warm. Now, of course, we have modern heat, but in those days, there's nothing like body heat. Right? Now you're wondering, why couldn't he have one of his wives? Well, his wives are old now. His wives are older. Right? He probably has some wives that are like in their 50s. Like Bathsheba might even be like 55. Because obviously he was like probably 40 at that point. She might have been 25, 26. We don't know. But he's got some younger wives. We know that. But he doesn't have like 20 and 30-year-old wives who can work on him all the time and help him and attend him. All right? So it's not... so this is not and very, very careful to say this is not a sexual thing. He's too old for that. He's dying. All right? But we look at that, but of course, I always get the question because it says, why did they have to find some young, beautiful woman? That's the inevitable question. If it wasn't about that, why did they have to find some young, beautiful woman? Well, he's still a man. I don't know. I don't have a lot to offer you there. He's still the king, and he's still a man, and he's probably, enjoying his last couple of days a little more. I don't know what to tell you. I'm going to ask him someday. All right? But Abishag or Abishag, I've heard it said all different ways, was not his wife because he did not sleep with her. Therefore, she was still open season and was still a virgin. That was the point, and that's why Adonijah later asked for her. Right? So that's just important because we kind of look at it that way, and because it says some young, beautiful woman, we just assume that's what it's about. It's not what it's about. It's to attend him and take care of him and be his attendant. And also lay down with him to keep him warm. All right? So anyway, and his wives are older. And, they don't, they're probably starting to have health issues and stuff themselves. Okay? So does that make sense to everybody? Okay. I tried to answer your question. That question usually comes up in people's minds, so I tried to answer it. But someday you can ask David, David, why did they have to get you some young, beautiful woman to keep you warm? Anyway, it's a little funny. Okay, so now what happens? Adonijah, the next in line. David has lost his first two sons. His first two sons are dead. Absalom was the second. Okay? So now the next son in line in the natural succession would be Adonijah. He's the oldest son. But he knows already that David has gone out of the way it's supposed to be and not followed it because he felt like the Lord chose Solomon, who's young compared. He's got a bunch of brothers ahead of him who's older than him. All right? But the Lord chose Solomon from Bathsheba. And Adonijah and some of the other guys don't like it because they feel like David's just being David. Can't just do things the way they're supposed to be. right? Adonijah's the next oldest. And obviously, Adonijah must have been a smooth character because he won a bunch of them over and they all liked him, right? Not everyone, but a bunch of them did. So, now one question usually comes up here is, was it knowledge of everyone to know? Did everyone know that Solomon was chosen? Because in the story, the way that Bathsheba is told by Nathan, right? And then he's very specific with the people that were invited. It seems to suggest that it was common knowledge, but we don't know if the whole nation knew it. That's what we don't know, right? But it does seem like the officials and royal people knew that Solomon was chosen. Obviously, Adonijah knew, because he would have invited everybody else if he didn't know, right? So now why I'm saying that is because we don't really know if all the people that Adonijah invited knew that David had given it to Solomon. We don't know, but we do know Adonijah and some of the top officials. Certainly Joab should have known. Anyway, so. But Adonijah doesn't like it, and he feels like he has enough support to do it the traditional way, meaning he's the oldest, he becomes the next king, and he's going to make the play. Now, why would he make it now before David dies? Because he doesn't want to wait for David to make the move to put the crown on Solomon. He wants to do it first. He has to beat it. Okay? So, anyway, they start and they pronounce, he carefully invites all these people, but leaves out a couple that he knows would never go for it. He knows who wouldn't, right? He knows the prophet wouldn't go for it. That Nathan would never go for it. Because Nathan was involved in the choosing of Solomon. All right? And so anyway, they declare this thing, and Nathan goes to Bathsheba. Now, why did he go to Bathsheba? Because she is still David's wife. Even though he's old and dying, she still has a certain respect and rapport with the king that if she comes in, he's gonna listen to what she has to say, right? So he goes to Bathsheba and he tells her that Adonijah has declared himself king. But didn't King David swear to you that Solomon, your son, would be king? So Bathsheba goes in to David and tells him that this is what Adonijah is doing this, and was this of you, or did you, because you told me, you swore to me that Solomon would be king. Remember, the Lord is the one that told David that chose Solomon, right? So, then Nathan comes in. He remember with Bathsheba, after she talks to him, then he would come in. So he comes in then and confirms her story and says, yes, Adonijah is doing this, and they both, though, are genuinely, I think, asking him, did you do something else and not tell us? Did you change your mind and not tell us? Right? There's a little genuine concern there. And, of course, David reiterates, no. Solomon will certainly be king, and I will do to you exactly what I swore to you. And then he tells them, do it now. Do it right now. Take Solomon, give him my mule, bring him down to the Gihon spring, which is the underground spring that going into Jerusalem, right? And there's tunnels under there. And of course, when they celebrate and scream under there, all the tunnels, it'll all be so loud and it will literally shake the city. That's why they went down to the spring, because it's underground caves. Okay? Thousands of people under there screaming and shouting at the top of their lungs would shake the city. All right? So, they do that, and of course then they do this royal procession, and of course they take Nathan, Abiathar's priest, not Abiathar, the other, Zadok, okay, Abiathar was actually with Joab, all right, and Bathsheba, and they go and they do this, and they put the crown on Solomon, and they sit him on the throne. Done. He's already on the throne. And then, of course, Adonijah hears them. They hear them celebrating and screaming. And what is this uproar in the city? And then they go, oh no, and they run. They all scatter and they run. And Adonijah runs for the horns of the altar. And you're wondering, what are the horns of the altar? What does that mean? Well, he thinks he can be safe. He goes into the tabernacle, and he feels like they're not going to kill me in front of the altar. You understand? They're not going to do that. So he thinks he's safe in there. And that's why Joab does it later. And of course, then Solomon says, well, fine. You know, this is righteous. The Lord understands this is what we should be doing for the Lord. And he goes, has him killed in there. All right? But anyway, this Adonijah now is pleading for his life because he feels like there's no way Solomon's going to let me live. Why? How could he? I just tried to steal the kingdom away. I'm a threat now. Right? Well, anyway, Solomon actually gives him a chance. Solomon actually acts like David here and says, no other son would do that. But Solomon does. And he says, no, don't kill him. We'll see if there's evil in him. What does that mean? We'll see his intentions. If he can let this go and move on and be an honorable man, then it's fine. All right? And he was going to forgive him completely and give him a clean slate. But of course, Adonijah couldn't let it go, could he? All right? And so Solomon is declared king. And that brings us to chapter 2. Okay. Beginning of chapter 2. As David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son, saying, now we're only getting a little bit of what he charged. In Chronicles, we get a lot more of what he said. And the main thing he tells Solomon like 50 times is to build the temple. Build the temple. Everything is ready. Everything is set. Build the temple. Honor the Lord. Follow his commandments. And of course, that's where we get the famous verse that David says to Solomon in Chronicles, which is, the eyes of the Lord goes to and fro, searching for a heart, and he knows the intentions behind the thoughts. If you seek him, you'll be found by him. All right, that's what David says to Solomon. It's in Chronicles. Great verse. Okay, and so he charged Solomon his son, saying, I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments and ordinances, his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn, so that the Lord may carry out his promise which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons are careful of their way to walk before me in the truth with all their heart, with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Now you also know what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, what he did to the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner the son of Ner and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he killed. He also shed the blood of war in peace. Now it says in NIV, it says, shed their blood as in wartime during a time of peace. Now, that is an interesting verse, even though I'm going theological here in an emotional section. But it is theological because David is making a clear difference that the Lord very much differentiates between war and peace. We all get that. A soldier in a battle is put on a battlefield and he has to fight to stay alive. And he didn't make the choice to be there. Whoever controls him and commands him made the choice for him to be there. Right? There is a difference. The Lord understands the difference. Now, the soldiers are still responsible for their moral choices of the innocent and things like that. But a soldier on the battlefield with guns shooting at him or people running at him with swords to kill him has to fight. Right? So, but I just think that that's a good theological verse there. I taught that to you in the beginning, but to show you that, that killing a man when you're not at war, is there's the righteous judgment of someone who is Joab committed cold-blooded murder and did not receive the punishment that he should have. And David is saying the blood guiltiness will fall on David's house and on Solomon unless Joab is dealt with. But see, Joab had such prominence with the men that the men saw David as king and Joab as the commander. And even though David wanted to get some other guys in there, the men still respected Joab as the best commander. If you're wondering, he killed Amasa, and yet they still followed him. Because Joab had won all of them. But Joab was completely loyal to David. Joab never made a move at David, but Joab didn't want to lose his position. Right? And he probably figured, I already committed murder once, why not do it again? Probably gets easier the second time. I don't know. That's just my opinion, but first time was still completely murder, but he killed his brother. And vengeance got in his mind. Of course, the vengeance is the Lord's, right? But this time, with the Mesa, he just didn't want to lose his position. He still wanted to be commander. That was all it was. All right? It was actually complete selfish motivation. But the only reason why I brought up the thing about the men respecting it is because you're wondering, why didn't David do it himself? Why didn't David command Joab to be executed? David felt because he said in another place that these sons of Zeruiah are too powerful for me. What he means by that is they have such a respect of the men. Right? And Joab and Abishai, his brother, have led them through all of these battles. Incredible. So the men are incredibly loyal to them. So that's why he couldn't just, the men would have a hard time with that. That's the point. Right? But he cannot allow this blood to be passed on to Solomon. He's very concerned about that. I'm just trying to give you perspective because it kind of looks like, David is just saying, just kill Joab. No, that's not what he's doing. He's saying that there's blood guiltiness on our hands unless Joab receives what he deserves, according to the law of Moses, and he's gotten away with it twice. All right? And of course, then we have the separation between war and peace. Obviously, we all know the difference, which is self-defense, right? Or cold-blooded murder. Okay. So, anyway, so Solomon obviously follows that. And Joab, what's interesting is Joab knows it's coming. He runs as soon as Solomon is made king because he knows. Maybe he liked Adonijah thinking maybe he could get away with it. Maybe they had a good relationship. Who knows? But then he also mentions to him Shimei, okay, and he was the guy who was a descendant of Saul when they went out running from Absalom, was throwing rocks and spitting on him and all that. Remember that? Mm-hmm. And David just sat and took it, and all of his men couldn't believe he was taking it. This is the king of Israel, the anointed of Israel, and this flea is throwing rocks at his head, and he's just taking it. But David said, let the Lord decide. But now he's passing it on to Solomon, and he feels like this guy was just such a danger, was so wicked. He says, you do what you think best, but he was evil and horrible. He doesn't tell him specifically to kill him. He only says that to Joab because it's what the Lord has commanded concerning Joab. But he told him to deal with Shimei, according to your wisdom that the Lord gives you. So he gives him a chance he gives him some rules to see if he's going to follow it. See if he's going to respect the king. Right? So I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but Solomon says to Shimei, okay, we know what you did to my father. We all know. All the men saw it. But yet, stay in the city of Jerusalem, city arrest. But do not go out. And the Lord gave it to him. We don't know why the Lord told Solomon to do this. But of course, somehow, the Lord knew the guy was going to move, wasn't going to listen. He was going to disrespect what he was told. He was going to break the rules. And he broke it for even a stupid reason. Right? So the Lord obviously gave that to Solomon, and the Lord knew that he wasn't going to follow it. So he then broke the king's direct command and brought it on his own head. Okay? So anyway, those are two. Now, those two things are not mentioned in Chronicles. That's what's interesting. Those two things come up here. Chronicles, Ezra the priest, focuses on the charging of the temple and following the commands of the Lord. There's a lot about that. But these two things aren't in there. These two details are here. Okay? Actually, Joab, no, I'm pretty sure. My brain is telling me that those two things specifically are here. But anyway, Of course, we get the word, don't let his gray hair go down to Sheol, okay, the waiting place in peace. And they run to the altar. And of course, Adonijah. Now, what does Adonijah do? David dies, right? Verse 10, then David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And the days that David reigned over Israel were 40 years. 7 years he reigned in Hebron, and 33 years he reigned in Jerusalem. 40 total. Okay? But he only reigned over all of Israel 33 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron, while there was a 7-year civil war between Judah and the rest of Israel. Remember? Okay. He's 80 years old. And of course, the Lord says an old man full of years. So the Lord obviously sees 80 still as being a full life. So at this time, but it is pretty drastic to look at. Moses was 120. You know, even going from Abraham, who was 175 or 78. Now David is 80, and that is a full life. Okay? Now, there's some guys that live older than him. Obviously, there was a bunch that did. But David lived a pretty hard life. Makes sense that his body caught up to him. Right? If you fought or on the run and know nothing but war most of your life, your body's going to be a little run down. So, anyway, once he dies, Solomon has already given Adonijah another pass. Now let's see what he does. Let's give him a chance to be an honorable man. He accepts that I'm king and accepts it and moves on, then okay. Well, of course, he makes a sneaky play. Now, if you're wondering why does Solomon react the way he does, is because of who Abishag is, and everybody knows who she is. You're wondering, well, David didn't actually sleep with her, so what's the big deal? The big deal is that she was completely associated as the king's attendant. And many people probably assume that he did sleep with her, because we only get it because they who wrote this was very careful to make sure we knew that detail. Right? The rest of the people probably assumed that she was one of his concubines or something. I've already explained that word to you. I don't have to explain it again. Right? Okay, good. So, Adonijah is making a sneaky play here. And of course, he goes to Bathsheba and he plays on her emotion. Oh, I was the next in line. But God chose Solomon. So, okay, that's fine. He acts like he wins her over by acting like he's okay, he understands. But could you just do me this one favor? And Bathsheba doesn't really catch on. She's thinking, oh, well, he seems so nice and he seems to get it. But Solomon, when she goes to Solomon sees right through it. What? He's not like he doesn't have a wives array. He's probably already has a couple of wives. Adonijah's not a young man. Okay? Solomon is in his 20s. Alright? Adonijah's in his 40s. Or at least 30s. He has a wife already. And he could get anyone he wants. Why is he going for Abishag? Alright? So there's a reason there. Solomon sees right through it and sees his intention. And of course it was his intention. He was trying to make a sneaky play. Right? So he hadn't let it go. He could have just let it go, even moved out of Jerusalem, gone somewhere, lived as a governor, or a son of David, and he didn't have to do this. It was still in his heart, right? So Solomon sees right through it, and of course Adonijah gets what was coming to him. And of course he runs to the horns of the altar. But of course we have Joab then runs to the horns of the altar. But this time Solomon says, you know what? Kill him in there. See, they never thought that they would execute them in the tabernacle, right? But Solomon then says, okay, if Joab won't come out, this is a righteous decree of God. This is God's law here. So God is not going to be offended by us carrying out his law. Right? So they execute Joab. And Joab was an old man at this point. If David's 80, He's got to be in his 70s,
Yeah.
right? Okay. So, and then Shemaiah breaks, so I already went through that, breaks and doesn't listen to Solomon. And so it ties up those three loose ends, and that brings us to chapter 3. Okay? And of course, chapter 2 ends with, thus the kingdom was established in the hands of Solomon. Now, what does that mean? Is, we don't understand it really, but you have to look at when a kingship is established, firmly established, when there's still things out there floating around the people. Well, maybe this guy could be king, or maybe this, it's unsettling, and it has to be secure. You can't have people out there trying to claim themselves as being king and trying to make place for the kingdom, right? Well, we just know how mankind is, and we all know that won't work, right? So that's why it says that, because these loose ends were tied up. Okay, chapter 3. Then Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Now, why is this a big deal? It's logical. This is what kingdoms have done forever. All of Europe was mixed in a lot of ways because they would make treaties by giving, your daughter to one of the princes, right? The princess comes from a foreign land to marry a prince, and the bloodline gets involved, and it was a way to honor the other kingdom and make peace treaties. That's how they did it. Now, it's not mentioned here, but later on we're going to see what happens. But it starts here. Why? Because the Lord is giving him incredible grace and doesn't bring this up. But what he is doing is breaking Torah. But, the Lord is giving him grace because he's a king and he's making, making a peaceful alliance here. But if he was really honoring the law of God, he would not be marrying a Gentile. Everybody see that? Unless she was a converted part of Israel, which she's not. All right? And David had 23 wives, didn't he? David but David didn't break Torah, did he? Because actually he was, according to Torah, he just had to marry Israeli women. Solomon is actually breaking it here. But the Lord is giving him grace. Everybody receives grace. The Lord is graceful. He deals with them in their culture. He doesn't expect perfection from them, does he? Or none of us would make it.
Yeah.
So he's extended grace here. But he doesn't learn a lesson, and he continues to make the mistake until it becomes God lets him go, and he just keeps doing it until it takes over him. Okay? It's not that Solomon had... No, you guys haven't gotten to the end of Solomon yet, have you? All right. Good. Because it's one of the saddest stories in the Bible. Okay? So sad, in fact, that Ezra the priest leaves it out in Chronicles. All right? Okay, well, we're going to end it here. It's a good place to pick it up in chapter 3. I want you to read to 1 Kings. Read the rest of 1 Kings. It's actually not that long. Maybe I should have you read a little more. No, just read the rest of 1 Kings. Okay, it's actually not that much at all. So we'll definitely get close to the very end, even maybe to the very end next week. Okay? Everyone have an awesome night. God bless.